It began not with a grand announcement or an official statement from Buckingham Palace, but with a quiet moment in an otherwise ordinary interview. Cameras had been rolling for hours, capturing the expected topics: royal duties, global diplomacy, and the weight of the crown, when King Charles paused, his eyes clouding over, as if he had momentarily forgotten where he was. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that precedes a confession no one is expecting. Then, with a voice that seemed to carry decades of unspoken words, he admitted, almost in a whisper, that Princess Diana had truly broken his heart. And not just in the way tabloids had speculated for years, but in a way far deeper, more personal, and more final. She had refused to forgive him for Camilla. That refusal, he suggested, was the unbridgeable gulf that neither time, nor apology, nor circumstance could ever cross. For a moment, it was as if the room had shrunk to nothing but him and those words. The interviewer, caught between professional composure and raw human curiosity, leaned forward. The sound engineer stopped adjusting levels. Even the low hum of palace life seemed to fade away. Here was the monarch of the United Kingdom, a man schooled in discretion, protocol, and centuries-old royal tradition, laying bare a wound that had never healed. It was not political. It was not ceremonial. It was human, and it was devastating. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This was not a confession about a policy decision or a public scandal. It was about love, betrayal, and the inability to reconcile. For those who had followed the story of Charles and Diana from the beginning, the revelation felt both shocking and inevitable. Their relationship had been scrutinized more than any royal marriage in living memory, dissected in newspapers, whispered about in palace corridors, and immortalized in grainy paparazzi photographs. The fairy tale wedding, the glamorous public appearances, the charitable work, all of it had been woven into a global narrative of romance and duty. But beneath the surface lay a truth far less idyllic, a marriage born under the shadow of another love, a love that never truly went away. To understand the weight of Charles's admission, you have to go back to the very beginning, before the wedding watched by hundreds of millions, before the titles and the ceremonies, before Diana Spencer became Princess of Wales. Charles had known Camilla Shand for years before he ever met Diana. She was intelligent, confident, and unapologetically herself. They shared a sense of humor, a taste for the countryside, and a bond that seemed to defy the formalities of royal life. But in the rigid structure of the monarchy, feelings alone were not enough. Camilla was not considered a suitable match for the heir to the throne at the time, and by the time Charles returned from his naval duties, she had married Andrew Parker Bowles. The door had closed, at least publicly, yet in reality, the connection between them never truly severed. Then came Diana. Young, shy, and from an aristocratic family, she seemed to fit the mold perfectly. To the public, she was the embodiment of grace and innocence. To the palace, she was an ideal choice for a future queen. And to Charles, she was, at least in the beginning, a potential partner who could help him fulfill his duty while offering companionship. But Diana was not just a box to be ticked on a royal checklist. She was warm, charismatic, and magnetic, and soon, she was the darling of the British people. The wedding in 1981 was billed as a modern fairy tale. But even then, the cracks were visible to those who knew where to look. Charles's heart was divided from the start. Camilla was still a presence in his life, their conversations and occasional meetings keeping alive an emotional connection that Diana could sense. Diana's intuition was sharp, and she knew from early in the marriage that she was competing with a ghost, or worse, a living, breathing woman who had already claimed a part of her husband's heart. That knowledge bred a bitterness she struggled to hide. The public smiles and carefully choreographed moments masked private confrontations that could be explosive, filled with hurt, frustration, and accusations that went beyond mere jealousy. When Charles sat down years later and admitted that Diana's refusal to forgive him was the deepest wound of all, he wasn't only talking about the affair. He was talking about what that refusal represented. The absolute collapse of trust, the finality of a decision that no matter what he did, no matter how many times he tried to explain or apologize, she would not let him back into her emotional world. In his eyes, her refusal was a lock, and she alone held the key. And she chose never to turn it. In the middle of the introduction, the story demands we slow down and consider the human dimensions at play. Charles was not just a future king. He was a man who wanted, perhaps needed, a certain kind of understanding from the woman he had married. Whether or not his actions warranted that understanding is another matter, and one that still divides opinion to this day. But to him, the absence of it was a constant ache. The marriage became a battlefield of silent treatments, public duties performed in parallel, and behind-the-scenes interventions by family and advisors trying to keep the facade intact. Yet the damage had already been done. And Diana, for her part, was not simply the wronged wife in a royal melodrama. She had her own voice, her own power, and her own narrative to tell. When she gave her infamous 1995 Panorama interview, declaring that there were 3 of us in this marriage, she was not just delivering a clever soundbite. She was laying claim to her version of events. That public declaration was, in many ways, the final confirmation that forgiveness was never on the table. It was an irreversible line in the sand. By the time the divorce was finalized in 1996, the relationship between Charles and Diana was less about reconciliation and more about survival. Survival for themselves, for their public images, and for the 2 young princes caught in the middle. The years that followed Diana's tragic death in 1997 did little to soften the memory. If anything, her absence made her presence in the public imagination even stronger. For Charles, stepping into his current role as king meant carrying not only the legacy of the monarchy, but also the unresolved legacy of his own personal life. As this confession has shown, time does not always heal in the way we expect. Some wounds remain raw, even after decades. In Charles's case, the heartache is bound up in the complexities of love, duty, and public life. A reminder that behind the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, human frailties persist. He is a man who has known adoration and scorn, who has been both the villain and the victim in the eyes of the public. And yet, his most enduring pain seems to come from the woman who once stood beside him at the altar, smiling under the weight of a tiara, with the world watching. This is where the beginning of our story leaves us, not in the certainty of answers, but in the tension of questions. Could Diana ever have forgiven him if things had been different? Was it pride, principle, or simply too deep a hurt that kept her from doing so? And what does it mean for a man, even a king, to live with the knowledge that the one person whose forgiveness he craved most withheld it until the very end? The story of King Charles and Princess Diana is often told through headlines, soundbites, and public speculation, but to truly understand the depth of the heartbreak Charles described, one must step into the private spaces of their lives, into the quiet moments that never made it to the tabloids. It is in these spaces that the tension, the misunderstandings, and the unspoken desires of 2 people became a narrative of sorrow and unfulfilled love, a narrative that would echo for decades in the lives of their children, the monarchy, and the world. Charles's own reflections reveal a man caught between duty and desire, between public expectation and private longing. From the beginning, his life was structured around obligation. Born to the monarchy, he was groomed to inherit the crown, to embody stability, tradition, and continuity. Personal happiness was always secondary, a luxury often sacrificed for the sake of appearance and protocol. Yet, human emotions are rarely bound by rules, and Charles's feelings for Camilla never fully dissipated. This lingering affection created a tension that would shadow his marriage to Diana, a tension that no amount of ceremony, public adoration, or royal pageantry could resolve. In those early years, Diana's presence was overwhelming to the public eye. She was youthful, radiant, and charismatic, capturing hearts around the globe with her grace and beauty. Her popularity grew exponentially, and in many ways, she became the face of the modern monarchy. But behind the smiles and the waving hands, she grappled with her own insecurities and suspicions. She sensed the emotional distance from Charles, an unspoken truth that Camilla remained a presence in his life. That knowledge, subtle yet relentless, shaped her experience within the palace walls. Her attempts to secure Charles's full attention and affection often collided with the reality of his divided heart, resulting in a cycle of tension and disillusionment that neither could escape. What makes Charles's confession so poignant is the notion of irreversibility. It was not merely that mistakes were made or that trust was broken, but that the opportunity for emotional reconciliation was permanently closed. Diana's refusal to forgive, particularly regarding his relationship with Camilla, symbolized a boundary that could not be crossed. Despite years of gestures, attempts at understanding, and personal remorse, the breach remained unhealed. For Charles, this was not just a romantic disappointment. It was a profound emotional wound, a rupture that would define his relationship with Diana until the very end. The dynamics of their marriage were further complicated by the relentless scrutiny of the media. Every interaction, every expression, and every public engagement was dissected and interpreted. Personal pain became a spectacle. Misunderstandings were amplified, and moments of vulnerability were transformed into headlines and rumors. In this environment, it was nearly impossible for genuine reconciliation to occur. Diana's public confrontations, her candid interviews, and her emotional transparency highlighted the fracture, making it a shared experience for the world to witness, yet never fully understood. Charles's relationship with Camilla continued to be a source of both comfort and conflict. Their bond, nurtured over years of friendship and shared understanding, existed in a liminal space, neither fully secret nor fully public. To Charles, Camilla represented not only romantic connection but emotional resonance, a companion who comprehended the pressures and idiosyncrasies of royal life. This connection, however, was in constant tension with the obligations of his marriage to Diana, creating a duality that neither he nor Diana could reconcile. Her steadfast refusal to forgive this part of his life transformed a personal preference into a profound point of contention, shaping the trajectory of their shared history. The impact of this fractured relationship extended beyond Charles and Diana themselves. Their children, William and Harry, were thrust into the center of a complex emotional landscape. The dissolution of their parents' relationship and the public nature of that dissolution imposed on them an early understanding of loss, disappointment, and the consequences of emotional conflict. Charles's pain, Diana's disillusionment, and the resulting public fascination created an environment where familial bonds were tested under scrutiny and pressure unlike any ordinary household. The heartache Charles spoke of was inseparable from the reality of raising children amid such turmoil, where forgiveness was not merely a personal act, but a public expectation, and where reconciliation was rendered almost impossible by circumstance. As the years passed, the legacy of their marriage, particularly the inability to bridge the emotional gap regarding Camilla, became a defining narrative. Charles's reflections reveal that the personal and the political are often inseparable in royal life. Emotional wounds do not heal simply because time passes or because public duties demand composure. Instead, they linger, shaping decisions, relationships, and public perception. The inability to be forgiven by Diana was not only a private sorrow, but also a poignant reminder of the limits of human reconciliation in the face of rigid societal structures, personal pride, and unyielding expectations. Understanding this dynamic provides critical insight into the complexity of Charles's current reflections. He is a man who has lived under the gaze of the world for decades, whose every choice has been interpreted and judged, whose personal heartbreak has been displayed for public consumption. Yet even with this exposure, the core of his confession remains deeply human, a longing for understanding, a yearning for forgiveness, and the profound pain of realizing that some emotional breaches cannot be mended, no matter the effort. This dimension of his life, often overshadowed by politics, duty, and scandal, is perhaps the most revealing and vulnerable aspect of his story. In contemplating this, it becomes clear that the narrative is not simply about infidelity or royal duty, but about the fragile, often contradictory nature of human relationships. Charles's longing for Diana's forgiveness was not merely about absolving past mistakes. It was about the fundamental desire to reconnect with someone who had once been the center of his emotional world. Diana's refusal, therefore, was experienced not just as rejection but as a profound emotional disconnection, a finality that reverberated through every aspect of his life. It is a reminder that forgiveness, while powerful, is also a gift that cannot be demanded, only hoped for, and its absence can shape lives in irrevocable ways. This introduction sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the complex interplay between love, duty, and public scrutiny that defined the relationship between Charles and Diana. The story that follows will delve into their early years together, the growth of public and private tensions, the pivotal moments that defined their emotional landscape, and the eventual confession that reveals the heart of Charles's enduring sorrow. We will examine the personal decisions, the societal pressures, and the emotional realities that intertwined to create a narrative both tragic and profoundly human, shedding light on the man behind the crown and the woman whose forgiveness he longed for but never received. This is where the introduction leaves the audience, at the cusp of revelation and understanding, prepared to journey through the chapters of love, heartbreak, and unfulfilled longing that define one of the most scrutinized relationships in modern history. The story ahead promises insight, emotional resonance, and a perspective that moves beyond headlines to the heart of human experience. The story of Charles and Diana begins long before the glitz of royal weddings or the glare of international media. In those early days, there was an intoxicating mix of youthful idealism, societal expectation, and the promise of fairy tale romance. Charles, in his early 30s, was a man shaped by decades of preparation for a role he had been born into. His life had been meticulously structured, every emotion and action guided by the expectations of monarchy and country. In contrast, Diana was a young woman barely out of her teenage years, thrown into a world she barely understood, yet ready to embrace it with charm, vulnerability, and a sense of hope that would soon collide with the complexities of royal life. Their initial encounters were steeped in formality, but underlined by an undeniable curiosity. Diana was introduced to Charles through social events designed to observe compatibility rather than foster affection. Yet, even in these structured settings, subtle dynamics began to emerge. Charles, often perceived as reserved and distant, displayed glimpses of humor and warmth, while Diana's natural charisma and openness created an immediate contrast. Observers noted her genuine delight in his presence, a spark that, for a time, seemed to promise a connection that could transcend protocol. The courtship itself was a delicate dance. Every gesture, from shared glances at public events to carefully orchestrated visits, was analyzed and scrutinized. Behind the smiling photographs and poised public appearances, both Charles and Diana were negotiating their own expectations, fears, and desires. Charles was drawn to Diana's youthful energy and charm, yet he carried with him the emotional baggage of prior relationships, including his long-standing connection with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana, meanwhile, navigated her own insecurities, aware of both the immense responsibility she was about to shoulder and the invisible comparisons that the world would inevitably draw between her and Charles's former and enduring affections. As the relationship progressed, the intensity of public interest grew exponentially. Every detail of their interactions, from hand-holding to subtle expressions, was dissected by the press. For Diana, this created both exhilaration and anxiety. She was thrust into the center of global attention, her every move a matter of public consumption. Charles, already accustomed to media scrutiny, was more measured, aware that any misstep could have ramifications not just for their relationship, but for the monarchy itself. This asymmetry in experience and expectation sowed the first seeds of emotional complexity. Diana eager to live a fairy tale love story, Charles bound by duty, habit, and lingering attachment elsewhere. Amid these pressures, there were moments of genuine connection that hinted at the potential for deep emotional intimacy. Private dinners, handwritten letters, and shared confidences offered glimpses of a relationship that could have flourished under different circumstances. Charles admired Diana's innate kindness and empathy, her ability to connect with people from all walks of life, while Diana found in Charles a figure of stability, intellect, and subtle humor. Yet, these moments were fragile, easily overshadowed by the relentless machinery of public expectation, the ever-present media, and the unresolved complexities of Charles's past. The engagement, announced in February 1981, marked both a culmination and a turning point. The world celebrated the union with fervor, captivated by the promise of a modern fairy tale. For Diana, the engagement was the realization of a dream she had scarcely dared to imagine. For Charles, it was a formal acknowledgement of a path he had long been preparing to follow. Behind the ceremonial appearances and media fanfare, however, both faced the looming challenge of reconciling personal desire with public duty. The reality of their emotional landscape was far more nuanced than the sparkling photographs suggested, and the pressures would only intensify as the wedding date approached. Their wedding, watched by millions around the world, was a spectacle of grandeur and symbolism. Diana, resplendent in her gown, represented innocence, beauty, and a new generation of royal charm. Charles, measured and composed, embodied the continuity of tradition and the weight of responsibility. The ceremony itself, while celebratory, was also a silent acknowledgement of the beginning of a journey that would be as complex as it was public. Behind the smiles and ceremonial perfection, both individuals carried personal doubts, unresolved feelings, and the weight of expectations that would later prove impossible to meet fully. In the weeks following the wedding, the initial honeymoon phase offered both promise and revelation. For Charles, the excitement of married life was tempered by the recognition that emotional reconciliation with Diana would require patience, honesty, and courage. For Diana, the intensity of royal life, coupled with the subtle distance she perceived in Charles, created early cracks in what the public viewed as a perfect union. Their interactions were a delicate balance between performing for the world and navigating deeply personal, unspoken tensions. One of the early indicators of the emotional challenges ahead was Diana's sensitivity to Charles's ongoing connection with Camilla. While Charles had committed to marriage, the past and the enduring emotional bond with Camilla were never fully severed. Diana, with a keen intuition and a sense of vulnerability, sensed that part of Charles's heart remained elsewhere. This awareness, though unspoken in the early months, began to shape her expectations, her insecurities, and ultimately, her response to marital difficulties. It was a subtle but persistent influence, an undercurrent of tension that would later define their interactions and emotional distance. At the same time, the role of media scrutiny cannot be understated. Diana was acutely aware that every misstep, hesitation, or expression of doubt could be magnified and misinterpreted. The public eye became both a stage and a prison, magnifying small disagreements into narratives of scandal or dysfunction. Charles, though more accustomed to observation, was not immune to the pressure. The combination of unresolved personal feelings, media intrusion, and the enormity of royal duty created an environment in which genuine emotional connection was extraordinarily difficult to sustain. By the end of the first year of their marriage, the signs of strain were becoming more evident. Differences in temperament, communication styles, and expectations revealed the fragility beneath the public facade. Charles's measured, often reserved approach contrasted sharply with Diana's expressive and emotionally transparent nature. Misunderstandings multiplied, compounded by the persistent shadow of past attachments and the pressure to maintain a perfect image for the world. What began as a hopeful and promising union was now navigating the complexities of personal conflict, public scrutiny, and emotional disconnect. Despite these challenges, it is important to recognize the sincerity of both parties' efforts. Charles and Diana each sought to understand and support one another within the constraints of their roles and personalities. The early days of marriage were not defined solely by conflict, but by attempts to bridge gaps, find common ground, and nurture a fledgling partnership. The tension, however, between personal history and the demands of public life proved to be a constant obstacle, one that would ultimately define the trajectory of their relationship. As Charles and Diana moved beyond the initial months of married life, the fairy tale perception that the public held began to collide with a more complicated reality. Behind closed doors, the pressures of duty, expectation, and personal history started to shape the rhythm of their lives, creating emotional fault lines that neither could ignore. What the world saw as regal elegance and charm often masked a more nuanced struggle, a dance between obligation and desire, between the expectations of monarchy and the vulnerabilities of two individuals trying to find common ground. One of the most significant sources of tension arose from the public and media scrutiny that was relentless and unforgiving. Diana, though young and inexperienced, quickly realized that her every word, gesture, and even her private emotions were fodder for newspapers, television broadcasts, and international speculation. Her personal anxieties and insecurities were amplified by this constant spotlight, magnifying ordinary marital challenges into perceived public failures. Charles, accustomed to the pressures of royal life, understood the mechanics of scrutiny but was less equipped to handle the emotional turbulence it created for Diana. His own struggles were compounded by the unspoken awareness that past attachments, particularly to Camilla, were a sensitive subject, one that Diana observed and internalized with growing concern. The dynamics of their relationship began to reveal patterns that would later become defining. Charles often approached conflicts with measured analysis, intellectual reflection, and a tendency toward detachment, a style honed over decades of preparation for his eventual kingship. Diana, on the other hand, was guided more by instinct, emotion, and a profound need for affirmation and connection. These differing approaches to communication created a persistent gap where misunderstandings multiplied and the risk of emotional isolation increased. Simple disagreements often escalated because neither had fully adapted to the other's way of expressing needs, frustrations, or affection. Another critical factor was the unrelenting influence of tradition and royal protocol. Every decision, every conversation, even the simplest displays of emotion had to be filtered through the lens of what was deemed appropriate for a future monarch and his consort. Diana, at times, struggled with these constraints, feeling confined and misunderstood. Her need for genuine emotional expression clashed with the carefully managed public image expected of her, and Charles, while more seasoned, was constantly negotiating the balance between personal desire and royal duty. This tension created an atmosphere in which authenticity was difficult to achieve, leaving both individuals feeling partially seen and partially hidden. The role of extended family and advisors added another layer of complexity. Courtiers, aides, and family members, while ostensibly supportive, often brought their own biases, opinions, and priorities into the marriage. Advice was abundant, but wisdom was mixed, and both Charles and Diana had to navigate a landscape where guidance sometimes blurred into pressure. Diana, in particular, was vulnerable to conflicting messages about how to behave, what to prioritize, and how to manage her public persona. Charles, meanwhile, was tasked with maintaining a delicate balance between personal happiness, public duty, and the expectations of the monarchy, a juggling act that would test even the most emotionally resilient individuals. As the months progressed, the cracks became more visible in both private and public spheres. The media began reporting on minor disagreements and projecting them as evidence of deep-seated discord. Tabloid narratives often exaggerated normal marital stress into stories of betrayal, conflict, or emotional instability. For Diana, this constant external interpretation of their private life created a heightened sense of scrutiny and self-consciousness. Every interaction with Charles, every remark made in public, was weighed against an invisible scale of societal expectation, leaving little room for spontaneity or honest emotional exchange. Within the royal household, there were also internal pressures that complicated their relationship. Expectations surrounding heirs, duty, and public appearances placed additional strain on Charles and Diana. The anticipation of children, for example, brought joy but also increased the sense of responsibility and the fear of failure. Diana, eager to fulfill her role as a mother while maintaining her public image, often found herself stretched thin. Charles, concerned with lineage, legacy, and public perception, approached these responsibilities with a calculated seriousness that sometimes clashed with Diana's more emotionally driven approach. The intersection of duty and desire, responsibility and vulnerability, created a tension that would shape their marriage for years to come. During this period, Charles made several attempts to nurture their connection, seeking moments of shared intimacy and understanding. Private dinners, quiet conversations, and gestures meant to bridge the emotional gap were met with varying degrees of success. Diana, attuned to subtleties and sensitive to perceived slights, sometimes misinterpreted these efforts, seeing distance where there was intention and formality where there was care. The difficulty of navigating these emotional subtleties was exacerbated by the intrusion of media narratives, court advisors, and public expectation, creating an environment in which even sincere gestures could be misunderstood or undervalued. Meanwhile, the shadow of Camilla Parker Bowles remained a constant, often unspoken, presence in Charles's emotional life. Though he had committed to his marriage, the depth and history of his previous attachment to Camilla created an undercurrent of tension. Diana, perceptive and intuitive, could sense this unresolved connection, and it fueled insecurities and emotional reactions that would later become pivotal in the narrative of their marriage. The inability to fully reconcile past attachments with present commitments created a persistent emotional gap, one that neither Charles's rational approach nor Diana's emotional openness could completely bridge. Public engagements during this period further amplified the strains. The couple was expected to appear united, charming, and impeccable, regardless of private discord. Every smile, every handshake, every glance was analyzed for signs of compatibility or conflict. For Diana, this duality, performing for the world while managing personal emotional turmoil, was exhausting and, at times, deeply isolating. Charles, while more experienced in public performance, was equally aware of the stakes, understanding that any visible discord could have lasting implications for both the monarchy and their personal reputations. As the pressures mounted, small disagreements grew into significant emotional rifts. Moments of miscommunication, differences in emotional expression, and the ever-present specter of past attachments created a pattern of tension that began to dominate the private landscape of their marriage. Both Charles and Diana were striving to honor their roles, maintain appearances, and navigate personal feelings, yet the combination of internal and external pressures made genuine emotional reconciliation increasingly challenging. By the end of this period, the emerging pattern was clear. Despite moments of connection and shared understanding, the interplay of public scrutiny, personal history, and emotional difference created an environment in which tension and distance were inevitable. Both Charles and Diana were acting with intention and care, yet their efforts were often thwarted by the complexity of circumstance, the demands of royalty, and the unspoken emotional legacies each brought into the marriage. What began as a hopeful union, rich with promise, was now grappling with forces that would ultimately define its trajectory and shape the emotional landscape for years to come. As time unfolded, the initial strains in Charles and Diana's marriage grew heavier, transforming from manageable disagreements into deep emotional fissures that neither could easily bridge. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface now demanded recognition, a reckoning that neither the couple nor the public could ignore. At the heart of this struggle was a fundamental clash between personal loyalty, past attachments, and the inexorable demands of royal duty. A collision that would shape not only their private lives, but also the narrative the world came to associate with the British monarchy. One of the most profound sources of this growing divide was the question of forgiveness, or the lack thereof. Diana's struggle to accept Charles's enduring connection with Camilla became increasingly pronounced. To Diana, this was more than a lingering attachment. It symbolized a betrayal that challenged the very foundation of trust and emotional intimacy. Every public mention, every discreet interaction with Camilla, every indirect reminder of their shared history became a point of contention and a source of emotional pain. While Charles viewed his past with Camilla as a closed chapter, Diana experienced it as an open wound that was never fully acknowledged, leaving her feeling exposed and undervalued in the marriage. Charles, for his part, found himself navigating an almost impossible emotional landscape. His attempts at reconciliation and reassurance were often filtered through the lens of rational thought, strategic thinking, and an awareness of public perception. He sought to address conflicts with reasoned conversation and carefully measured gestures, hoping to demonstrate commitment and resolve. Yet, Diana's emotional responses, driven by sensitivity, intuition, and a need for affirmation, frequently clashed with this approach. Charles's logic, while sincere in intent, was sometimes interpreted as detachment or avoidance, further intensifying the emotional gap between them. Public scrutiny only magnified these private struggles. The media had begun to treat their marriage as a spectacle, one in which personal pain and private misunderstandings were broadcast, dissected, and sensationalized. Every interaction, whether cordial or tense, was reported and analyzed with intense speculation. Diana, deeply attuned to public opinion and often consumed by the need to manage her own image, experienced this as a form of external pressure that amplified her internal emotional turmoil. Charles, while accustomed to media attention, found himself caught between defending the dignity of the institution he represented and navigating the very human complexities of his personal relationships. The relentless attention made private reconciliation even more difficult, as both parties were forced to perform, conceal, or temper their true feelings under the ever-watchful eye of the public. As these tensions grew, so too did the accumulation of unmet expectations and unresolved grievances. Diana's perception of Charles's attachment to Camilla became intertwined with broader feelings of neglect, unfulfilled promises, and emotional isolation. Charles, meanwhile, felt constrained by the dual responsibility of managing his own emotions while upholding the appearance of a stable, functioning marriage. The interplay of these emotional and social pressures created a pattern in which both parties were constantly attempting to negotiate their needs against the expectations and judgments of others, a negotiation that rarely resulted in mutual satisfaction or understanding. Family dynamics further complicated the situation. The influence of royal advisors, extended relatives, and household staff introduced an additional layer of scrutiny and interference. Advice, often offered with the intention of guiding or protecting, sometimes carried implicit judgment or bias, influencing perceptions and reactions in subtle yet significant ways. Diana, attuned to nuances of loyalty, trust, and emotional fidelity, was sensitive to these influences, often interpreting them as indicators of Charles's own emotional priorities or allegiances. Charles, aware of the delicate balance between personal discretion and public obligation, was similarly navigating a landscape where every decision could carry unintended consequences. This constant interplay between private emotion and external influence reinforced the sense of an unbridgeable divide. Within this context, attempts at reconciliation became increasingly fraught. Charles would initiate gestures meant to signal commitment and understanding, whether through private conversations, thoughtful acts, or subtle public acknowledgments. Yet, these gestures were frequently overshadowed by the weight of accumulated grievances, unspoken resentments, and lingering doubts. Diana's responses, often shaped by deep emotional intuition and a desire for authenticity, did not always align with Charles's intentions. What he experienced as a sincere attempt at connection could be perceived by her as insufficient, conditional, or even disingenuous. The result was a feedback loop in which efforts at emotional repair were continually undermined by prior disappointments and unresolved conflicts. This dynamic reached a critical point as the couple's awareness of public perception collided with their private realities. Diana, acutely conscious of how she was being portrayed in the media, began to assert her perspective more forcefully, seeking both emotional validation and public recognition of her experiences. Charles, on the other hand, was navigating the delicate task of preserving institutional reputation while managing his own emotional needs. The tension between personal authenticity and public expectation became a defining feature of their interactions, creating a pervasive sense of frustration and disconnection that neither could fully articulate or resolve. The inability to reconcile these differences culminated in what Diana would later describe as an unforgivable divide. This divide was not merely a matter of lingering attachment or miscommunication. It represented a fundamental incompatibility in emotional approach, perspective on loyalty, and response to external pressures. Diana's refusal, or inability, to forgive Charles for his enduring bond with Camilla became emblematic of this larger emotional chasm. For Charles, it signified a barrier to rebuilding trust and restoring intimacy, a recognition that certain wounds, once opened, might never fully heal. The emotional reality was stark. Despite mutual care, shared history, and the weight of public expectation, some differences were unbridgeable, shaped by past experiences, personal values, and the inexorable force of human emotion. Even as this divide became more apparent, Both Charles and Diana continued to strive for moments of connection, attempting to bridge the gap with gestures of care, shared experiences, and tentative vulnerability. These attempts, however, were frequently fleeting, interrupted by the relentless pressures of public scrutiny, personal insecurities, and unspoken histories. Each effort highlighted both the possibility of emotional reconciliation and the profound difficulty of achieving it, creating a sense of tension that was both compelling and tragic. The narrative of their marriage, now widely recognized as a story of profound love constrained by circumstance and human limitation, captured the attention of the world precisely because it reflected the complex interplay of intimacy, expectation, and unfulfilled desire. This period, marked by the emergence of the unforgivable divide, set the stage for the subsequent trajectory of their lives. It demonstrated how unresolved emotional attachments, differing communication styles, and the weight of public expectation could coalesce into an enduring chasm, one that would influence not only their relationship, but also the perceptions and actions of those around them. The divide between Charles and Diana was more than a marital issue. It became a lens through which the public, media, and royal family viewed the interplay of personal choice, institutional duty, and the enduring challenge of human connection. As the years progressed, the private pain between Charles and Diana no longer remained confined to the palace walls. It began spilling into the public domain in ways that would forever alter the narrative of their marriage. What was once a delicate, private struggle became a spectacle for the world to witness, dissect, and debate. The media, relentless and omnipresent, began documenting every perceived slight, every emotional fissure, and every rumor, creating a climate in which the personal and public became indistinguishable. The intrusion into their lives was pervasive, shaping not only their public personas, but also influencing their private emotions and decisions. The first signs of this intrusion were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Paparazzi began lingering near royal residences, capturing fleeting moments of interaction, private conversations, or even solitary walks. Photographs taken out of context became fodder for speculation, and minor gestures or expressions were magnified into alleged evidence of discord or infidelity. Each headline, each photograph, and each story contributed to a growing narrative of a troubled marriage, with Diana often portrayed as the sympathetic figure caught in a web of emotional neglect. Charles, meanwhile, was increasingly depicted as distant, preoccupied, and emotionally unavailable, a narrative that intensified public scrutiny and shaped perceptions of his character. The media's intrusion was not merely a matter of observation. It became a driving force that influenced both behavior and emotion. Diana, sensitive to public opinion and acutely aware of the scrutiny she faced, often found her own actions and reactions filtered through a lens of anticipated judgment. Every public appearance, every charitable engagement, and even personal interactions were analyzed for subtext, meaning, and implication. For Charles, who valued discretion and measured communication, this environment created a constant tension between authenticity and performance. Each move had to be calculated not only for its immediate emotional impact, but also for how it would be perceived by an increasingly inquisitive and judgmental public. This intense public gaze began to exacerbate existing tensions within the marriage. Diana's need for emotional validation became intertwined with her awareness of public perception, creating a dynamic in which private grievances were reinforced and amplified by the outside world. Charles, often constrained by the expectations of royal protocol and the necessity to maintain institutional integrity, struggled to reconcile his personal feelings with the demands of his public role. The resulting friction was less about individual actions than about the interplay between private emotion and public narrative, a complex and often unmanageable dynamic that neither could easily navigate. As media scrutiny intensified, both Charles and Diana found themselves engaging in a subtle but pervasive battle over narrative control. Diana, increasingly articulate and aware of the power of public opinion, began to communicate her perspective through carefully mediated channels, interviews, and public appearances. These moments allowed her to express personal experiences and emotions indirectly, shaping public perception while maintaining a degree of distance from direct confrontation. Charles, while less inclined to public disclosure, faced the challenge of defending his own actions and preserving his reputation amid a barrage of speculation and commentary. The interplay of these efforts created a high-stakes environment in which every word, gesture, and expression carried weight, influencing both personal relationships and public perception. One pivotal aspect of this intrusion was the way it transformed private grievances into public spectacle. Misunderstandings and disagreements, once confined to the intimate spaces of the palace, became widely discussed narratives, amplified by media outlets and echoed in public discourse. Each revelation, whether accurate, exaggerated, or entirely speculative, contributed to a growing sense of inevitability, the sense that the marriage's challenges were no longer private matters but shared cultural events. This transformation not only intensified emotional pressure but also limited opportunities for authentic reconciliation, as every attempt at resolution risked misinterpretation, public critique, or further amplification. The intrusion also affected their children, who were inevitably caught in the crossfire of public attention and familial tension. Prince William and Prince Harry, young and impressionable, experienced the dual reality of private family strain and public scrutiny. Their understanding of familial dynamics was filtered through media narratives, creating additional layers of complexity in their relationships with both parents. Diana's protective instincts, coupled with Charles's attempts to navigate protocol and public image, resulted in a delicate balancing act, one that often placed emotional strain on all family members and underscored the pervasive influence of external observation. A particularly striking dimension of media intrusion was the creation of symbolic narratives that resonated far beyond individual actions. Charles's continued attachment to Camilla was interpreted not only as a personal matter, but as a symbol of betrayal, longing, or emotional indecision. Diana's responses, often framed by both personal sensitivity and strategic communication, were cast as emblematic of resilience, courage, or emotional authenticity. These symbolic narratives amplified emotional stakes, creating a situation in which the couple's private pain was intertwined with broader cultural meaning. Public opinion, fueled by headlines and photographic evidence, became a force that actively shaped their experiences, reinforcing patterns of mistrust, resentment, and emotional distance. The intersection of private emotion and public scrutiny reached a dramatic climax, with high-profile interviews and revelations that left lasting impressions on the world. Diana's candid disclosures, whether in media interviews or public appearances, communicated personal anguish while simultaneously challenging established narratives about the monarchy. Charles, constrained by institutional expectations, found limited avenues for personal expression, often relying on measured statements, controlled appearances, or indirect messaging to convey his perspective. The imbalance of expressive channels. Diana's ability to communicate widely versus Charles's restraint further complicated the emotional and narrative dynamics of their relationship, creating enduring perceptions of misunderstanding, neglect, and betrayal. Throughout this period, the emotional impact of media intrusion on Charles and Diana cannot be overstated. Each headline, photograph, and speculation added layers of complexity to already strained dynamics, influencing decision-making, shaping emotional responses, and limiting opportunities for genuine reconciliation. The relentless attention acted as both magnifier and amplifier, intensifying existing grievances and creating new pressures that neither could fully anticipate or control. In effect, the world itself became a participant in the unfolding drama, influencing behavior, shaping narrative, and reinforcing emotional divides in ways that were simultaneously visible and invisible, immediate and long-lasting. Ultimately, public revelations and media intrusion became inseparable from the story of their marriage. The private and personal could no longer exist independently. Every emotional fissure, every attempt at connection, and every gesture of reconciliation was filtered through public scrutiny. This dynamic contributed to the enduring perception of an unbridgeable divide, solidifying narratives that would define both Charles's and Diana's public identities. The consequences of this intrusion reverberated not only through their own lives, but through the lives of their children, the royal institution, and the global audience captivated by the unfolding drama. The heart of the story of Charles and Diana lies in the persistent, almost desperate, attempts at reconciliation that, despite their earnestness, never quite bridged the growing emotional chasm. Beneath the public facade of protocol, appearances, and royal duties, a turbulent sea of longing, regret, and unresolved tension simmered. Charles, aware of the irrevocable damage inflicted by his ongoing relationship with Camilla, sought repeatedly to find a path toward mending what remained of their fractured marriage. Yet each step forward seemed to collide with an invisible wall, erected not from malice alone, but from years of hurt, misunderstanding, and the complex intertwining of personal pride and public perception. The initial attempts at reconciliation were subtle, often couched in private gestures, fleeting communications, and behind-the-scenes negotiations orchestrated by aides and confidants. Charles, who had spent much of his life adhering to the rigid demands of royal protocol, had to navigate the delicate task of demonstrating sincerity without creating further scandal. Letters, phone calls, and occasional private meetings became the instruments through which he sought to express regret, hope, and a desire to rebuild trust. Each communication carried with it the weight of historical grievances, the fear of misinterpretation, and the knowledge that even the most intimate of expressions could eventually find their way into the public eye. Diana, for her part, responded with a complex mixture of caution, skepticism, and residual affection. She had endured years of betrayal, public scrutiny, and emotional neglect, and any overture toward reconciliation required careful consideration. Her initial reactions often reflected a desire to protect herself emotionally while assessing the authenticity of Charles's intentions. There were moments of tentative hope, glimpses of what might have been, but these were frequently overshadowed by a pervasive wariness born of experience. The struggle to reconcile was not simply about personal feelings. It was about navigating a labyrinth of expectations, loyalties, and potential consequences. One of the key obstacles to genuine reconciliation was the issue of trust. For Charles, demonstrating remorse and commitment necessitated not only words but sustained actions over time. He had to show Diana, consistently and convincingly, that his devotion to Camilla would no longer undermine their marriage or continue to cause emotional harm. For Diana, rebuilding trust meant overcoming the accumulation of betrayals, both real and perceived, and reconciling her own expectations with the reality of Charles's emotional and relational history. Each misstep, each delayed response, and each perceived insincerity threatened to erode the fragile progress that might have been made. Another complicating factor was the pervasive role of intermediaries and advisors, whose influence often blurred the line between personal reconciliation and strategic maneuvering. Royal aides, counselors, and family members frequently intervened, offering guidance, negotiating meetings, or even shaping communications to protect the institution rather than the individuals. While some of these interventions were well-intentioned, others introduced additional layers of complexity, as intentions became intertwined with strategy, and genuine emotional overtures were scrutinized for political or public consequences. The presence of so many voices, each with their own agendas, often created confusion, hesitation, and missed opportunities. The emotional struggle extended beyond individual interactions to the broader context of their lives as public figures. Every gesture toward reconciliation was colored by the awareness that their private attempts were inextricably linked to public perception. The media's watchful eye, the expectations of the monarchy, and the scrutiny of an invested public all contributed to an environment in which vulnerability carried significant risk. Diana, in particular, had learned to navigate this terrain with a heightened sensitivity, understanding that openness could be both empowering and dangerous. Charles, accustomed to discretion and formal channels, found the constant balancing act emotionally taxing and strategically challenging. Despite these obstacles, there were moments when genuine connection seemed possible. Private conversations, shared reflections on their children, and mutual recognition of past mistakes occasionally created a fragile sense of hope. Charles would often attempt to convey that he still valued Diana not only as a partner, but as a co-parent and an individual who had profoundly shaped his life. Diana, while often guarded, would respond in ways that reflected both her enduring concern for their children and a nuanced appreciation of the complexities of their relationship. These moments, however brief or fleeting, underscored the emotional depth of their bond and the human yearning for understanding and reconciliation, even amidst profound disappointment. Yet, the path to reconciliation was continually obstructed by Diana's inability to forgive Charles for Camilla. This issue was not simply about personal preference or jealousy. It touched on core aspects of trust, loyalty, and emotional safety. Diana had been hurt deeply by the perception that Charles's affections were divided, and the continued presence of Camilla in his life represented a tangible reminder of past betrayals. Every attempt by Charles to bridge the gap was thus filtered through the lens of this unresolved grievance, creating a recurring cycle of hope, effort, disappointment, and emotional retreat. No matter how sincere Charles's intentions appeared, the inability to move past this specific wound consistently undermined progress. The struggle to reconcile was further intensified by the psychological and emotional toll of prolonged conflict. Both Charles and Diana experienced stress, anxiety, and fatigue associated with ongoing interpersonal tension, compounded by the public dimension of their struggles. The emotional exhaustion often manifested in defensiveness, miscommunication, and heightened sensitivity to perceived slights. In this environment, even small misunderstandings could escalate into significant emotional ruptures, further hindering efforts to rebuild trust and understanding. The intensity of their shared history meant that each interaction was charged with layers of past grievances, unspoken expectations, and unhealed wounds. Family dynamics also played a crucial role in shaping attempts at reconciliation. The perspectives, advice, and interventions of extended family members, including Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, and other senior royals, influenced both the timing and nature of reconciliation efforts. These figures often acted with the dual objective of preserving familial harmony and protecting the monarchy's public image, creating additional pressures and constraints on personal decision-making. The presence of these influential voices sometimes facilitated progress, but at other times introduced tension as personal desires were weighed against institutional priorities. The interplay between private emotional needs and familial expectations added yet another layer of complexity to an already fraught process. Throughout this struggle, the children remained a central consideration and, paradoxically, both a bridge and a barrier to reconciliation. Charles and Diana shared a profound commitment to the well-being of William and Harry, which occasionally created opportunities for mutual understanding and collaboration. Moments of shared concern for their children allowed for temporary alignment and glimpses of emotional intimacy. However, the very presence of the children as points of connection also highlighted the impossibility of fully resolving adult grievances. Decisions about parenting, public appearances, and private interactions were constantly influenced by the need to protect the children, often constraining the freedom necessary for personal reconciliation. Ultimately, the struggle to reconcile was defined by the tension between desire and reality. Charles's repeated efforts to mend the marriage, to bridge emotional divides, and to express sincerity were continually challenged by Diana's unresolved pain and the broader context of public scrutiny and institutional expectation. The interplay of personal emotion, historical grievances, and social pressure created a situation in which reconciliation remained tantalizingly possible, yet persistently elusive. Each step forward seemed counterbalanced by an equally powerful force pulling them apart, reinforcing the narrative of a marriage caught between love, regret, and irrevocable differences. As the years unfolded, both Charles and Diana found themselves increasingly isolated, each grappling with profound emotional burdens that were as public as they were private. The pressures of royalty, combined with the intensely scrutinized personal lives they led, created an environment in which loneliness was unavoidable, even when surrounded by staff, aides, and family. Charles, despite his position as heir to the throne, experienced a persistent sense of isolation born from the very constraints of his role and the failures of his personal relationships. Diana, meanwhile, contended with a paradoxical combination of global attention and intimate solitude, the public fascination with her every move amplifying the private anguish she could not escape. For Charles, isolation was not simply a matter of physical separation. It was a deeply internal experience. The burden of expectations, both as a future monarch and as a husband, weighed heavily on him. Each decision, each attempt at reconciliation with Diana, was colored by the awareness of historical mistakes and the ever-present shadow of Camilla, whose continued presence represented both personal desire and public complication. The inability to reconcile his feelings with Diana's unwillingness to forgive created a persistent emotional tension, a tug-of-war between guilt, longing, and the desire for personal fulfillment. He often found himself trapped within his own thoughts, replaying past events and imagining alternative outcomes that might have preserved the union he once hoped to maintain. Diana, in turn, carried a profound sense of emotional isolation, one that was magnified by the relentless gaze of the public and the media. Every personal decision, every intimate conversation, risked becoming fodder for headlines, speculation, and scandal. This constant intrusion into her private life made it difficult to process her emotions in a safe, authentic space. Despite her outward confidence and poise, she experienced moments of vulnerability that were intensely private, filled with longing for understanding, empathy, and the simple human need to be heard. Her inability to forgive Charles was not rooted in vindictiveness alone. It reflected a deeply human response to betrayal, compounded by the extraordinary pressures of life under constant scrutiny. The isolation each experienced was compounded by the cyclical nature of regret. Charles often found himself reflecting on the consequences of his early choices, wondering if different actions might have altered the course of his relationship with Diana. Every public appearance, every statement, and every personal interaction became a reminder of opportunities lost and missteps that could not be undone. For Diana, regret manifested in a more personal, introspective form, focusing on the emotional costs of trust, vulnerability, and the complex interplay between love and betrayal. Both carried a sense of what could have been, an ever-present tension between past decisions and present realities that shaped their emotional landscape. This period of isolation was also marked by the complex dynamics of public perception. The world watched Charles and Diana, projecting narratives onto their lives that were only partially grounded in truth. Paparazzi photographs, magazine exposés, and televised interviews created a relentless backdrop of judgment and commentary that intensified feelings of loneliness. Even as they attempted private reconciliation or moments of genuine connection, the pervasive awareness that their struggles were being observed and dissected added layers of anxiety and emotional strain. Trust became not only a matter between husband and wife, but a negotiation with the unseen audience that seemed always ready to interpret and judge. Within this isolation, both Charles and Diana wrestled with the weight of regret, a burden that shaped their behaviors, decisions, and interactions. Charles's regret was multifaceted, encompassing remorse over past infidelities, the failure to fully repair his marriage, and the unintended consequences of his emotional choices. Diana's regret was similarly layered, encompassing the pain of betrayal, the impossibility of complete forgiveness, and the challenge of maintaining personal dignity amid public fascination. Each regret carried not only personal weight, but also relational consequences, reinforcing the emotional distance that separated them and complicating any attempts at genuine reconciliation. The physical manifestations of isolation were mirrored by emotional and psychological effects. For Charles, the constant balancing act between duty, personal desire, and public expectation created chronic stress, moments of anxiety, and an enduring sense of emotional fatigue. Diana's isolation similarly produced emotional exhaustion, leading to episodes of introspection, private sorrow, and the search for solace in relationships outside the royal family. Both sought support in different ways, Charles through advisors, confidants, and structured interactions, Diana through friends, charitable work, and occasionally the media, but each found that the tools available to them were insufficient to fully alleviate the profound sense of solitude. A critical dimension of this emotional isolation was the impact on their children. William and Harry were acutely aware of tensions between their parents, and the distance created by unresolved conflict inevitably affected their sense of security and family cohesion. Charles and Diana, despite their individual struggles, shared a common commitment to the well-being of their sons, yet the emotional divide between them complicated parenting decisions, communication, and the modeling of healthy relational behavior. The children became, at once, a source of connection and a reminder of unresolved issues, deepening the emotional complexity of the situation. Isolation and regret also fed into the narrative of missed opportunities. Both Charles and Diana frequently reflected on what could have been achieved had forgiveness been possible, had empathy been more fully exercised, and had circumstances allowed for a different trajectory. These reflections were not merely nostalgic, but carried with them the emotional weight of lives lived in tension, shaped by choices and constraints that could not be undone. The lingering question of whether reconciliation might have been achieved under different conditions remained a persistent undertone in both their experiences, haunting their private thoughts and shaping their public personas. The emotional isolation of Charles and Diana was compounded by the unique pressures of their positions within the monarchy. Their individual struggles were inseparable from institutional expectations, royal protocols, and the historical weight of the crown. Every personal decision was contextualized within the broader narrative of duty, legacy, and public image. This entanglement of personal and institutional responsibility heightened the stakes of reconciliation, magnified the sense of loneliness, and added an additional layer to the weight of regret they each carried. Their struggle was not merely private but inseparable from the complex, demanding world they inhabited. Ultimately, the isolation and regret experienced by Charles and Diana served as both a backdrop and a catalyst for the broader story of their relationship. These emotional states influenced decisions, colored interactions, and shaped the trajectory of their lives in ways that were deeply human, yet amplified by their extraordinary circumstances. The persistent inability to bridge emotional divides, despite repeated efforts, underscores the profound challenge of reconciling past hurts, navigating complex relational dynamics, and managing the relentless pressures of public life. Their story, at its core, is a poignant exploration of loneliness, longing, and the enduring human desire for understanding and connection amidst insurmountable obstacles. Camilla Parker Bowles, a figure whose presence in Charles's life predated his marriage to Diana, became both a source of solace and a lightning rod for controversy, creating an intricate web of emotional tension that defined the trajectory of his relationship with Diana. Their history was not a simple affair of infidelity or betrayal. It was a complex narrative, steeped in years of emotional entanglement, shared experiences, and unresolved feelings that had simmered quietly beneath the surface, only to erupt at moments when public and private pressures converged. Understanding Camilla's role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage requires a nuanced exploration of her influence, the emotional stakes involved, and the broader societal context that both magnified and distorted the realities of their interactions. Charles's relationship with Camilla was rooted in familiarity and mutual understanding. They shared a bond that went back to their youth, a connection forged through long conversations, mutual interests, and the subtle emotional support that often accompanies a relationship built on shared history. Unlike the whirlwind romance and intense public scrutiny that accompanied his union with Diana, the bond with Camilla offered a measure of comfort, a space where Charles could express aspects of himself that were constrained by the formalities and expectations of royal life. Yet this familiarity, while emotionally sustaining, also represented a persistent source of tension, particularly as it clashed with the responsibilities and public perceptions attached to his role as a husband to Diana. For Diana, Camilla's presence was an ever-present shadow, a tangible reminder of betrayal that could not be easily reconciled. The emotional wound inflicted by the knowledge of Charles's ongoing connection with Camilla was profound, touching the core of trust, intimacy, and dignity within the marriage. It was not merely an abstract sense of hurt. It manifested in concrete ways, in heightened vigilance, in moments of confrontation, and in the undercurrent of tension that defined their interactions. Diana's inability to forgive Charles for his enduring attachment to Camilla was fueled by the depth of her emotional investment, the intensity of her public exposure, and the perception of being trapped in a marriage where the heart of her partner remained partially elsewhere. Camilla, meanwhile, occupied a delicate and often misunderstood position within this dynamic. She was simultaneously a confidant, a source of emotional fulfillment for Charles, and a symbol of discord in the public eye. Her influence was complex. She did not actively seek to dismantle the marriage, yet the emotional reality of her continued presence created irreconcilable tension between husband and wife. For Charles, Camilla represented both stability and temptation, a paradoxical figure whose role in his emotional life was inescapable and deeply entwined with the personal regrets and desires that he navigated daily. The duality of her position, as both an object of enduring affection and a focal point of marital conflict, underscored the extraordinary challenges faced by Charles as he sought reconciliation with Diana while remaining emotionally tethered to someone else. The public perception of Camilla amplified the emotional stakes exponentially. Media narratives often painted her as the villain in a tragic love triangle, simplifying a deeply complex emotional landscape into digestible stories of infidelity, betrayal, and scandal. Headlines sensationalized her involvement, casting her as the agent of marital destruction while rarely acknowledging the nuanced interplay of emotions, history, and circumstance that defined her relationship with Charles. This oversimplification intensified Diana's sense of betrayal, compounded Charles's feelings of guilt, and created a broader social narrative that both framed and constrained their individual and collective experiences. Every public sighting, every mention in print, every whispered rumor became an additional layer of tension, a reminder of unresolved feelings and unspoken truths that shaped the contours of their marriage. The emotional reality within the palace walls was further complicated by Charles's attempts at transparency and reconciliation. Despite his ongoing attachment to Camilla, he made repeated efforts to bridge the gap with Diana, to communicate his regret, and to seek forgiveness. These efforts, however, were invariably filtered through the lens of public expectation and personal insecurity. Diana's resistance to forgiveness was not a simple act of defiance. It was a considered response to the depth of her hurt, the ongoing visibility of the emotional betrayal, and the recognition that certain boundaries, once crossed, could not be easily restored. Charles's repeated entreaties for understanding and reconciliation were met with both empathy and resistance, reflecting the complex interplay between accountability, desire, and the limitations imposed by human emotion. Camilla's role was also shaped by the broader cultural and historical context of the time. The late 20th century was a period marked by evolving social attitudes toward marriage, fidelity, and the role of women within public life. The monarchy, as an institution, was both insulated from and highly responsive to these shifts, navigating the delicate balance between tradition and contemporary expectation. Camilla's presence highlighted the tension between private desire and public duty, illustrating the challenges inherent in maintaining personal authenticity within an institution defined by symbolism, protocol, and scrutiny. Her influence on Charles and Diana's marriage cannot be understood in isolation. It is inseparable from the societal pressures, media narratives, and institutional expectations that framed their lives.